Hello and welcome to another conversation on Bournbrook Magazine's YouTube channel. We've had some good responses to some of our previous discussions and would love to carry on getting these out, so let us know if there's anybody you want us to interview and we'll get in touch with them. I'm Michael Curzon, Bournbrook's editor, and today I'm delighted to be talking to William Clouston, who's the leader of the SDP, and Rod Liddle, who's a member of the SDP and also a journalist and author. We talk about the SDP's new Charter for Academic Freedom, about the wider debate around free speech, as well as the SDP and where it fits in the wider political culture. I hope you enjoy it. Well, thank you both for agreeing to do this then. We are in lockdown, but I thought we could at least pretend that we weren't for at least 20 minutes and talk about something else, because that's all we're hearing about on the news at the minute. And I was interested in the document which the SDP released recently, the Charter for Academic Freedom. And I thought before we talked about the specific details of the Charter and what the different points are within this, it's worth talking about why it's needed anyway. Because when I've just finished at university, and often when the topic of free speech at uni is brought up, you're met with the claim, there's no need, free speech is fine here, it's just about controversialists who are moaning that you can't get a word in. Is this true, or is there actually a problem with free speech at uni? If I could start with Rod, just so we're not all talking at once, do you think that there is a proper problem with free speech at universities?
Well, there's an enormous problem, and on a wide variety in a wide variety of different areas. So, firstly, I think universities have become increasingly monocultural, in that there is one view of the world, one political view of the world, one ideology which holds sway, and that therefore students aren't, as I was, when I was a student, and that was back in the 80s, given a sort of gamut of interesting worldviews, of differing worldviews, a multiplicity of things from which we could choose what we might adhere to or what we might consider as being our own views. Today, it's not like that. It's increasingly totalitarian view as well, because those who disagree with it are frequently, we've seen this in the media over the last 5 years, hauled, either kicked out completely or vilified or are stopped from speaking. And it's true of people who are invited into universities to speak, whether they be TERFs, trans-exclusionary radical feminists, or gay campaigners such as Peter Tatchell, or Miriam Namazi, an Iranian communist. These people are banned from speaking because they don't toe the line on a number of very narrow ideas of the woke left.
And an interesting point you raised there as well is that when you talk about free speech, people often presume that it's just right-wingers who are complaining about it. But obviously you mentioned there Peter Tatchell, and Jermaine Greer might be another example of people who have been excluded from campuses. William, if I could ask you, to what extent then is this problem of free speech sort of a problem not just for the right but for everybody at university?
I think it is a problem for everyone, but I think there's been a collapse in viewpoint diversity in the academy, particularly in the social sciences. So I think, STEM subjects not so much, and in fact, it probably doesn't affect them as much anyway. But if you look at the data produced by people like Jonathan Haidt in the States, and we mirror that culturally, in the 1960s and 70s, possibly 30 or 40% of your tutors and professors would have been, arguably to the centre or centre right. And that's collapsed. Now, in most modern universities would have literally 90-odd% liberal left view. And that's not really sufficient. I mean, whatever you think of the arguments, socially conservative arguments against liberal arguments against others, it's not a good situation for the academy to simply lack viewpoint diversity. And what happens as a consequence is that you get this sort of goldfish bowl view, an increasing intolerance. And really that's the thing that's that's affecting undergraduates. Undergraduates pay their fees, and let's face it, the fees are expensive, and they're going on tick, so they're going to pay them back if they get reasonable jobs. And they're not being given what they ought to be given, which is as Rod said, the full gamut, the full range of viewpoints. And certainly in the social sciences, it's not as if you can argue that traditional conservative viewpoints aren't worthwhile. I mean, we've sadly lost Roger Scruton recently, but how could you argue that it's not worth reading Scruton from any point of view at all? So that's the problem, I think, and obviously that's given rise to a situation on campus where this is fed through from the professors and the tutors through to the undergraduates, and more generally because our cultural institutions lack viewpoint diversity as well. That basically people have lacked confidence to even state an alternative view. And that's a desperately unhealthy situation for a society to be in. I mean, no debate is no way to run an open democratic society. So it is a problem it needs dealing with.
Yeah, one of the points I'm most interested in, I think, in the Charter is the first point, which talks about the right to express thought without intimidation. And that talks not only about what is being taught at the universities, but also the way in which students themselves engage with each other. Because I've found at my time at university that often one of the biggest problems people have when debating is a fear that saying a certain thing, however modest or controversial, will lead to a backlash where people start spreading rumours about them or saying things about them online, things like this. I suppose an interesting question from that would be, how do we change that? If it is about also a culture of intimidation, how do we prevent people or stop people wanting to intimidate others for expressing certain opinions?
It's extraordinarily difficult. And indeed, that fear that they have that if they say something which transgresses the vacuous shibboleths of the liberal left, it's entirely real. I mean, they may well indeed be vilified and excluded and subject to some sort of trolling. And this is because for a large tranche, it's a large tranche within universities, it's a tiny tranche within Great Britain, but for a lot of those people, they think that things are sorted. It's a kind of extension of Marx's idea of historical inevitability. They think that it's all been sorted and that it's kind of scientifically sorted and objectively true, and so that it cannot ever be gainsaid. And that's where the problem comes from. It comes from that problem of certainty and from the problem of absolutism. Now, how you get around that, I do not know. It is incredibly difficult to do. I mean, over the last 30 to 40 years, probably 40 years, somehow this intolerance of differing opinion has managed to root itself not merely within the universities, but also within what I would call our liberal elite and what John Gray calls hyperliberalism. It's a kind of hyperliberalism which is very much illiberal and doesn't have anything in common with the liberalism which, as British people who remember John Stuart Mill would know before, indeed it's antithetically opposite to that. How you change it, I don't know. I would fine universities if they don't have diversity of opinion. I think it should be written within their charter that there has to be a diversity of opinion taught. And I think that also any students who feel vilified, excluded, bullied, punished, simply because they state their point of view, should have the right, without question, to ensure that that stuff stops immediately. And that the people who do it are punished, because short of a revolution within our elites, of which the universities are but one, it's very difficult to see how you change it.
I think one of the most worrying points of this as well is that we're talking about people at university, and now we're talking about people being intimidated against debating. But whilst these people who are intimidating others are students now, they will, because they're in these positions, one day be the journalists, the party leaders, the politicians in other senses. How much could this affect our wider political culture unless charters such as this one are implemented and properly enforced?
I think, just to go back to what Rod was saying there, I think one of the ways of dealing with it actually happens anyway, which is a sort of clustering. What you get is pockets of institutions which are better than others, and there are some that are comically bad. But actually, word gets round is one of the most powerful things. And in the States, some of the places that have had the worst examples, the most egregious examples, Evergreen College and places like that, the answer is actually people will walk. Parents will dissuade their children from having a look at those universities' options, and you get inevitably places like Buckingham and University of Kent, which are better than many of the others, and people will cluster towards that. But I think the biggest thing we need to challenge is this really infantile goodies and baddies narrative. That's where this whole thing starts. It's the idea that holding a particular position, and it may be on metaphysics or mereology, as something as abstract as that, but the idea that holding a particular position on that makes you a bad person. What a ridiculous idea, and an anti-intellectual idea at that. And I think challenging these ideas, I think, where we start, really. It's not, you can have a different view. I mean, actually, I think what we're trying to do, certainly in launching the Charter and, sort of getting this to roll a little, is to try and get people to be a little bit more grown up. And, the real academic position, intellectual position, is actually one of civilized indifference to what someone else thinks. Yes, you can debate them, but if your view doesn't accord with mine, fair enough. And that's the position you're trying to foster, really. And certainly, in the academy, if you don't accept a particular position, well, let's debate why. But unfortunately, we've got this sort of cultural revolution atmosphere in the academy, and it's not as bad, but it's like that, isn't it? It's accusative and intimidatory. But the curious thing, another sort of green shoots thing, I would say, is that it's the noisy, bossy people that are doing this. And quite often in a lecture theatre or a student seminar room, actually, I would say 60-70% of people are fed up with this stuff. And what we need is actually people to be a little bit more assertive, and and also to ridicule those that can't take it. If you are at a modern university, and the assertion of a different point of view causes you to have a meltdown, you've got a problem. You really have a problem, and that's worthy of ridicule, I think.
That's right. Sorry, carry on, Rod.
No, I was just going to say, I think that's exactly right. It is a minority. The trouble is, it may well be a majority within the academic body of the lecturers. That's the real problem, far more than the students. And Will talked earlier about how this was particularly the case within the social services, and of course he's right. It's particularly true of sociology, gender studies, and all those victimhood studies which we now have as university courses. And of course the provisional wing of sociology, geography, which used to be very different. But it's not just that, and don't be lulled into a false sense of security that if you avoid facile subjects, you will somehow escape this. Already in America, one professor, Rochelle Gutierrez, has described mathematics as being racist.
Right.
And there is an argument from her that maths is a means by which white people have underpinned their supremacy. And that is reflected as well in attacks upon some of the hard sciences, such as physics, but particularly physics. And the means by which people get into universities to study physics is also changing. There are ways now in the United States where you can get in to study physics if you don't know anything whatsoever about physics and maths, because they feel that physics is not sufficiently democratic. So it's not just the social sciences, and of course it's also obviously rank throughout the study of English literature, even in schools. So it goes very, very deep, and it is dangerous, I think, particularly when it starts meddling. We already know that they meddle with reality. They meddle with reality, to my view, when they say that a transgendered bloke is as authentic a woman as a woman who was born a woman. But it gets even worse once they start saying, yeah, but this physics stuff, this physics stuff, it's all a bit anal and conservative, isn't it? I don't need a more intuitive approach to physics. And that is what some people are saying. We need a more intuitive and pastoral approach to physics, which, is, I think, mentally disturbed.
That's crazy. It's crazy.
Where did this come from?
It all follows, doesn't it? It all follows the line that because this is a problem, and I've mentioned this before, that once you begin, for example, the transgender issue, I don't think there are many people in the country at all, perhaps 1%, who would go along with the current idea, which is supported by government, supported by the liberal elite, supported by universities in the NUS. It's nonetheless got virtually no support in the wider country for saying that a man who's transgendered into a woman is as authentic a woman as someone who was born a woman, and that it's actually down to the chromosomes, and that's science. And I think most people buy that. But once you tug on that thread, all of these liberal arguments fall apart like a jumper knitted by a moron, because they have no sense to them. There is literally no sense. And so it's very easy, once you've decided that if you are a bloke who wishes to be a woman, you can be one, and that's it, and science doesn't matter. It's quite easy from there to hop on to saying, physics, don't rate that very highly. Shouldn't we have a different approach?
It's important. There was a Durham philosophy undergraduate about 3 or 4 years ago who actually edited one of the Phil journals at Durham. I'd studied philosophy at Durham, and I was amazed to hear that he was removed from his position as editor of this journal, given no support from colleagues or fellow undergraduates or the department for saying that women don't have penises. Now, whether you agree with that position or not, certainly as a philosopher, it's a mereological question, and it's worthy of debate.
They don't, Will.
Well, they don't. No, but it's astonishing.
I don't know, but they just don't. I mean, this is the thing you run into, that actual reality has no bearing whatsoever on what they believe. It is a fantasy world.
It is collective.
And as soon as you get yourself in a fantasy world, anything becomes possible.
Yeah. But it's very dangerous. It's very. And it's astonishing how far it's gone. If a Phil undergraduate can't make, first can't say that without being removed as an editor. But it's a perfectly legitimate position to be in, and it's a perfectly. You could argue it'd be absurd. It's like saying, if you were sort of a Cartesian dualist, and you're making a case for that, and someone's a materialist. So, well, sorry, you just can't think that. I'm going to remove you from the position of editorship of the journal. It's absurd. Absolutely ridiculous.
It's the point that regardless of the view on it, the whole point of the university is to be able to debate something freely and to share different opinions then.
Exactly, yeah.
How much do you think, this charter, that the opinions throughout it, that people should be able to speak freely at universities, that lecturers should judge writing purely on academic performance? How much support do you think that will have from the major political parties in the country, from the Conservatives and Labour, for example? Would they agree with this, or would they be a bit hostile to some of the points?
I think Labour would certainly be hostile to it, because I think they're up to their necks in this stuff. And virtually everything they do reinforces it. So I think they are certainly part of the problem.
The Lib Dems and the
Lib
SNP.
Dems, almost probably worse, actually, the Lib Dems.
Yeah.
I mean, the Conservatives have been very, very weak-willed, and they've failed to hold any line, basically, and we'll wait and see what happens. I think I mean, if you're going to be optimistic about this, you'd have to say the Conservatives are a whacking great majority, and if they can't be a little bit more mainstream in their position on this, they never will be. And I'd hope they will be, but we'll wait and see. I mean, you know, the next thing is gender self-ID. Are they going to hold the line on that or not? Are they just going to give in? We won't hold our breath, but we'll wait and see. I mean, as you know, the Conservative Party isn't terribly conservative.
I mean, I think Will's dead right. So far, the Conservative Party has been incredibly weak on this. It's a Conservative government which is overseeing the various rather brutal transitions at the Tavistock Clinic. It's a Conservative government which is insisting that underage 10-year-old children should be taught about the benefits of transitioning. You know, they are so wildly out of step with public opinion. They do it because they're scared, I guess. It all dates back to that Theresa May thing. We don't want to be seen as a nasty party.
Yes.
Which I think is where it comes from. I mean, what we would like, or what we can offer, is we're just a small party, but we would like students on campus to know, listen, if you've suffered anything like this, if you are finding it difficult to make your views heard, or you suffered bullying, or you are judged by your lecturers according to your political opinions rather than according to the quality of your academic work, we are here and we're listening to you. Get in touch with us and we will help in any way we can. Get in touch with me, get in touch with Will, get in touch with the party generally. We will be the party which supports people who have, you know, suffered some kind of imposition upon their lives as a consequence of fatuous woke bullying.
What do you make, Rod, of the Free Speech Union?
Pretty good. I like it a lot. I worry a little about the involvement of some of the American far right in this. It's you know, it's very, very difficult. But I think that what Toby Young has done is good, worth supporting. I've signed up to it and donated some money to it. And I think, yes, it goes hand in hand with what we're doing.
Yes, and it's the point as well, which you brought up, just that those who feel they aren't being given the chance to talk freely have somewhere to go to get some support almost, which is what the Free Speech Union is trying to do, and what you're trying to do with the SDP through this charter then as well.
That's right. I think the difference is that Toby's union will largely be looking at high-profile cases, which perhaps such as that of Noah Carl, for example. Whereas what we would like, I think, is for it to be far more grassroots and for ordinary students just to contact us. It may not be because they've been bullied. It may just simply be to point out an absurdity. You know, just get hold of us. Just let us know, and we will do what we can.
And academics as well, because remember,
yes.
Because during, I mean, that was actually the three, you know, the post 2016 Brexit situation. We had many academics in the party that felt they were being threatened, and the standard situation that they said in universities in London and Manchester and other places, who were party members, you know, Social Democrats, who said, look, you know, fellow academics would come up to them and said, look, you know, actually, I have the same view on the nation state and sovereignty, but I could never say. And that's the environment we're in, where an academic couldn't. I mean, it was estimated, wasn't it, if there can be such a thing, 10%, possibly a little bit more voted, but it could have been more, and you would never know. The point is, you'd never know because they just have to be quiet.
Yeah, terrible. I mean, the worst case was, and obvious case was. Over the referendum, not within universities, though I heard it put that universities were something like 91, 92% in favour of Remain.
Yeah.
Again, I would say is, you know, not healthy as a means of dividing opinion. But within schools, and have numerous reports of teachers who had been pro-leave, who were forced to leave the profession. Actually forced to leave the profession, and that it cannot possibly be healthy.
And I remember reports at the time as well, from even at primary school, of teachers asking their pupils which way their parents were voting, and responding in a certain way, relating to that as well, which is even scarier, especially at such young ages with that.
Michael, you asked about the Labour Party. I mean, just on that, it's interesting that Starmer is assembling his shadow cabinet and so on. And, he's obviously made terrible mistakes, hasn't he, the last couple of days in Naz Shah and things like that. Dreadful. I thought he was going to deal with anti-Semitism. He's obviously not interested in doing so. But if you look at the list of names, as far as I can tell, not a single person in his shadow cabinet voted according to the mainstream view on sovereignty in 2016. Not a single one. So whatever else they're trying to do, they're still absolutely hopelessly misaligned with the British people.
It's almost a blindness to what's going on, an inability to adapt to.
Yeah, that's exactly it, Michael. Yeah.
Well, we've talked a bit about academic freedom and with the Charter, but we discussed as well before something else which is worth talking about is the SDP more generally. And I think what you've just said, William, leads us on well to that. Where do the other parties fail mainly, and where does the SDP hope to cover up these failures and make up for them? William, I'll start with you, since you're the leader of the party.
Oh, that's a very broad-ranging question. I think, strangely enough, I think the SDP's position is really a reaction to both main parties failing in a similar way, but in different ways. So I think the thing that goes all the way back, and I think is still relevant now as it ever was, is that the Conservative, they get the relationship between the state and the market wrong, both parties. So the Conservatives have been, pathologically hostile to state action in certain areas, and so we've had years and years of liberalisation. And it's actually, we're at the end of that. Everyone can see we're at the end of that process. But they haven't been able to recognise the value nor respect where state action is needed. Possibly because for various reasons, ideological and otherwise, possibly their constituency hasn't been interested or relied on what the state does too much. But you've got this, privatise everything. See the price of everything, the value of nothing. And I think it's what it's resulted in Conservative administrations is just an indifference. They are continually indifferent about things that really matter. And some things that should be their domain, like the importance of the family as a sort of foundation stone for society. They've basically been taken in by the individualism of the last 30, 40 years. So that's their problem. I think the Labour Party have been historically, again, you can argue slightly different under Tony Blair, but the hostility that the present Labour Party have for the market and for surplus and profit and enterprise is astonishing, absolutely astonishing. And they simply don't get the fact that you can't tax a loss. And if you're that hostile to the market, you will not have a successful society. So the unique position that the SDP has is understanding the social dimension, but also the social market. Basically the idea that the state and the market are not opponents. They're two parts of the same society, and both are necessary.
That's really interesting. Rod, have you been a member of any parties in the past, and why, when you did you join the SDP? Which of these values that William just talked about really appealed to you?
Pretty much all of them. Yes, I have. I was a member at the age of 14 of the Young Communists. Right. I was a member at the age of 16 to 16 3/4 of the Socialist Workers' Party, neither Washington nor Moscow, but International Socialism. I was a member from 1978 until 2017 of the Labour Party. But for the last 10 years of the Labour Party, meaning both Blair and Corbyn, I'm increasingly disillusioned, as I was part of the blue Labour fringe of Labour, and as someone once put it to me, Corbyn and Blair, two cheeks of the same liberal arse, which I tended to agree with. And I come from the northeast of England, Middlesbrough, just as Will does. Will comes from the northeast as well. It seemed to me that the party, rather in the way of the Democrats in the States, had just lost its connection with the people it was set up to support, which was the working class, the blue-collar voters, and particularly of the North, and that its values, a bit like the BBC in a way, had drifted further and further away from what I considered working class values. When I look at the House of Commons, 650 MPs, of which 600 are social liberals. You know, yes. I'm not a social liberal. And at the same time, I could also see a far greater case for, I didn't have a huge problem, I have to say, with John McDonnell's economic plans going into the last election. A few problems, he went too far. And some of it was fantastic in the proper sense of the word. But in terms of, tax rates and so on, I sort of had some sympathy. I have a lot of sympathy with state intervention. I think the state has to do something. I'm not a small state kind of person. So when I read the SDP's new declaration written by Will, and I think Kevin, was it, Will?
It was a few people chipped in, yeah. I mean, it was 5 or 6 people. Some quite well known and are anonymous, but you probably work out who it is. But yeah,
well, it just resonated immediately, And I'm someone who has always revered John Gray, and this seemed to be John Gray turned into a political party. It's a shame we don't actually have John as a member.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair appraisal. But I think the fondness, or no, not the fondness, the belief. Actually, it's the belief, because what's the dispiriting thing about so many conservative governments has been that they just don't believe that anything can be done. It's this complete poverty of aspiration in that the state can do make a difference, and I think the state can and must. And I just think, what we haven't talked about, obviously we're all three of us are in this lockdown and then we've got this dreadful pandemic, but
yes,
this is going to seriously adversely affect all public sector balance sheets, and it's going to have a very profound effect on the West. But whatever you think of what's happened in the past, the answer is not more of the same. I mean, the model has deindustrialized our countries. It's been indifferent to who produces what and where they produce it.
Yeah,
this is everywhere. I mean, we've got a new Agriculture Act, which is going through at the moment, and quite rightly, it's given greater emphasis to environmental concerns, and I think that's all to the good. But actually, they need to think about food security as well. And some of the things that we talk about are considered quite old-fashioned, but actually, they do have widespread support among the public. I mean, another thing we need to think of in a macro scale is to look at how much we import. I mean, we can't have imports running at sort of, I think it's 35% of GDP now. It's just far, far too high. There's been indifference to where things are made. And the role of China in this is catastrophe. Again, we were vehemently against the Chinese being involved in 5G, but we felt that we were sort of, crying in the dark. But I mean, for heaven's sake, come on, wake up. Some things matter.
It is interesting, isn't it, that suddenly you wake up one morning and the world is a very different place. And suddenly some of the things which we've been saying seem a bit more reasonable and less dated than they once were, such as an affection for the nation state and the need to have decent borders, an end to untrammeled immigration, a check on globalization, just a check that it is not an untrammeled good. You know, that there are bad things which come with it as well as the smaller things which we're seeing now every day, which is a belief in our state institutions, such as the NHS, a certain greater communitarianism and localism, which we're also seeing as a consequence of this. So all of these things which were once seen as, and I might add, the discipline of staying under lockdown, all of these things which were once seen as terribly conservative and outdated, are suddenly au courant once again.
Yeah. I thought as well that it's in some ways it's revealed a few points which for years we've been told aren't possible, yet the lockdown has revealed it is possible. For example, on the police, for so long we were told there aren't enough police about. There must be about 10 left in the country, because whenever anything happens, whenever there's drug users in the park or something like this, there's no police about to go and tell them off for this. But as soon as we're put into lockdown, they're everywhere, and they're patrolling every street and stopping every dog walker. It sort of put an end to the argument as to whether or not there are any police available, which is an
Yes, I think they prefer arresting dog walkers to drug dealers. It's easier, isn't it?
Yes.
I have grave reservations about what the police are up to these days, and I'm writing about it in the Sunday Times for Sunday. But you're right, of course, yeah. But you know, the affection for the NHS, which we have, is there, and also a sense that we're all in this together. You may have noticed that, with a few exceptions, the whole identity politics stuff has disappeared. We are all in this together, you know, and I think that's generally accepted.
So we'll have to see how this translates into politics and general culture when the lockdown's over. Are you optimistic that these issues will carry on, or that it will go back to normal when this is all through?
I think things will be different. Actually, I think I'm reasonably optimistic that there will be some sort of shift in outlook. And actually, anyway, I mean, in as much as some of this is led by economics, these catastrophic economic events tend to have very large tail effects. So, for instance, in the global crisis in 2008 in the States, Labour participation plummeted. I think it's about 5% of people never re-entered the labour market after leaving it in that event. So these things tend to have profound effects. But I think it'll be seen as a threshold. Actually, I think it probably will be seen as a threshold. People certainly will be more alive to, as Rod said, a sort of mindless liberalism that we've been fed. Sort of coke ad stuff, the world, everyone can go wherever they like, whenever they like. The idea of borders is not necessary and is very old fashioned. No, I think that's gone. I think the crisis changes that.
I'll just chip in with, I mean, I'm a less pleasant human being than Will, and less optimistic. And I suspect that people will be flying off to piss in the streets of Ayia Napa within 2 months of the lockdown being lifted. However, in a deeper sense, if you remember 2008, if you remember the time before 2008, state ownership and nationalisation was simply unthinkable. Under Tony Blair, under John Major, under Margaret Thatcher, everyone was agreed there was no room for it whatsoever. It was inefficient, and for ideological reasons, everything was privatised. Sometimes for good reasons, but mostly for ideological reasons. As soon as that financial crisis occurred, and the campaigning socialist George Bush nationalised the banks, as soon as that happened, suddenly nationalisation was back on the cards. And you now have a state where a large majority of us wish to see, for example, our rail services in public hands and our utilities in public hands, which would never have happened without that crisis, I don't think. So things can change.
Yeah.
I think that's a good optimistic note to end on with the politics side. I'm very glad that this has worked, because we've we've been using the technology, which we haven't been. It sounds like we're all useless at technology anyway. But I thought if we could ask a non-political question to end. It seems like we have got a bit more time to be spending in the lockdown. It doesn't seem completely unlikely that it's going to be extended. And this is a question based on a tweet I saw you put up the other day, William, about jazz and John Coltrane. What music might we be listening to help pass time by during this period, do you think? Something to give us to do whilst we're still in lockdown?
Well, I'm just going to say what I've been listening to today, which is pretty. I listen to jazz every day, pretty much. But this morning, I was listening to Constant Lambert,
Right.
1924 piece, Pomona. Very good, challenging, and I think actually now as we've got the time, let's listen to things that are a little bit more difficult, and require a few listens before it gets through.
Mm. And Rod,
let me contribute the precise opposite, and that we should listen to things a little less difficult. I've been listening to a lot of minimalist stuff, and especially a new album out this week by the Revolutionary Army of the Infant Jesus, a weird Liverpool collective which do wonderfully, a bit like Arvo Part and Niels Fram, very quiet, meditative stuff. But at the same time, I've also been listening to Sturgill Simpson's gut-busting ZZ Top style country album, which is fabulous. I think, that and reading. It's a good time for reading.
Yes.
Yeah.
We've been forcing our 14-year-old daughter to read right-wing books for a few months.
Oh, very good.
Yeah.
She'll get in trouble when she gets to university then.
She'll be, when she gets back to school, she'll be sent home, I would imagine.
There'll be some sort of code, Rod. She'll be able to sort of, indicate that she's sound in some way.
Yeah, whilst wearing her Cecil Rhodes T-shirt.
There you go. What a point to end on. Thanks for both very much for your time. I really appreciate that.
Kind, thanks for the invitation, Mike.
Join
Join us for another conversation on Bournbrook's YouTube channel soon.